Hey guys, my name is Ben, and I will be presenting a review and retrospection of SDSU's Living Writers series for the spring 2023 semester, led by Professor Megan Marshall. As the spring 2023 semester comes to a close, I find myself reflecting on what I've learned during SDSU's Living Writers series. My reflections bring me back to one of our starting conversations where we read David Olin's essay, Is Literature Dead? And we're asked if we truly believed if literature was dead, and if so, what was the role of the modern author in today's society? Olin starts his essay with an anecdote about his 15-year-old son complaining about the work expected of him in his middle school writing class as they dissected Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, ultimately ending with the assertion that literature is dead. Olin seems to cede this point with little to no resistance by pointing at the entry masters that are required reading in grade school: Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Steinbeck, Faulkner, and lamenting how their relevance has declined when applied to contemporary experience, and simultaneously insinuating that there haven't been any modern masters to fill in their shoes. According to Olin, this was through no fault of literary writers, but more a symptom of the insidious nature of modern media that doesn't require finely crafted stories. Even without the benefit of Professor Marshall's insightful instruction, it's easy to discard that argument as reductionist and short-sighted. It's the equivalent of an art critic saying that there's been no real art since the Renaissance masters, and there's been no point in artists trying unless they tried to replicate those masters, and thereby halting art's evolution to pay deference to the standardized definition of high arts. While these works are beautiful in their own right, if art had stopped with the Michelangelos, the Da Vinci's, the Raphaels, and the Donatellos, we would have missed out on the Rembrandts, the Bruegels, the Manets, the Monets, the Renoirs, not to mention the countless others from the following waves of reform. Just like with art, if we hold our writers to a singular standard and discount them as pedestrian because they don't write with the same style as overindulgent 20th century expats drinking in European bars, then we'd be defrauding ourselves of the next evolution of beauty and understanding. It's narrow-minded and borderline insane to say that great literature stopped with the modernist era, to discount the works of civil rights greats like James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and John Howard Griffin, ignore the cynical geniuses analyzing modern society and extrapolating them into believable dystopian futures in classics like Fahrenheit 451, Fight Club, American Psycho, and Starship Troopers. Forget the mind-bending sci-fi worlds created in the Hyperion Cantos, the Ender series, and collective works of Philip K. Dick. Now, while it's easy to discard Olin's thesis with these easily recognizable masterpieces, many of which have been adapted into movies or simply incorporated into the zeitgeist, it's also just as easy to forget that these were once unknown authors, bravely trying to have their voices heard while they questioned their own abilities. It's even easier to forget that there are contemporary authors, unrecognized out there, continuing to challenge the status quo and influencing the next era of writing. I think that by expanding my awareness to include a few more of these influential authors was one of the most valuable aspects of the Living Writers series. Each brought a unique voice and focused their talents to exhibit new ideas and techniques that enriched our understanding of what writing and poetry is. Our analysis started with Andrew Kelly Stewart's We Shall Sing a Song into the Deep, a novella written in the most traditional prose of the series. In this post-apocalyptic narrative, Stewart masterfully blends religious zealousy with militant obediency and takes the trope of the stoic way hero, cursed to wander an expansive earth that's been liberated of society by a cleansing war, and inverted it into a teenage heroine named Remy, crammed into a derelict nuclear submarine as part of a crew of kidnapped child soldiers known as choristers, and led by a fanatical Kaplan determined to carry out God's final judgment with the boat's final missile. Instead of a protagonist guided by an incorruptible moral code derived from a lifetime of badassery, we see Remy nurturing her inherent humanity to challenge the oppressive zealousy that has molded the submarine's communal order her entire life. Next, we moved into one of the most challenging pieces of the course, at least for me: Elizabeth Houston's Standard American English. Next we moved into one of the most challenging pieces of the course, at least for me, Elizabeth Houston's Standard American English. In this piece, the author wrote in a poetic style best described as surrealism to invoke the uncomfortable feelings brought on by an activist street performance as we navigated the world through the eyes of an abused and mentally tortured baby. This disorienting and distressing style often left me as a reader feeling the need to protect myself, as Houston forced me to contemplate my own participation in late-stage capitalism, shallow social justice causes, a disingenuous modern art culture, and other institutions that often push marginalized communities further away. All of this was done while acting as a shameful voyeur to baby's most intimate thoughts and observing the grammatical and poetic rules that Houston knowingly disregarded. Next, we were introduced to the art of text collages in Naoko Fujimoto's We Face a Tremendous Meat on the Teppan. This chapbook was a collection of poems that explored the subtly intricate nature of the intergenerational trauma produced by wars. By immersing the reader in frightening scenes of World War II bombings on Japan in one stanza, and with dizzying speed transporting them back to the present with the next stanza, the reader was able to deepen their understanding of how war scars generations and the soil. Along with the colorfully rich language and deconstruction of time, the poems were further enhanced by the visual aesthetics created by Fujimoto's creative editorial style that visualizes scenes in the written words. A great example of this is in the title poem, where a war scene is written with words popping off across the page and paragraphs abruptly appearing and disappearing. This piece was also written in a graphic novel form that's available on Naoko's website that added a completely different understanding to the work that I would highly recommend checking out. Next, there was Manuel Paul Lopez's Nerve Curriculum, another poetry chapbook that immersed the reader in the mestiza consciousness, a term coined by Gloria Anzaldúa, with a setting centered around growing up in a Mexican-American border town. This lyrical poetry faithfully simulates the reality of a Latinx youth growing up in one of these border towns, with the subconscious absurdity of a child's imagination trying to fill in the disparities between what they are told and what is actually happening. By using the style, Lopez gives the reader the chance to experience an immigrant child's perspective, by forcing them to consider what was reality and what was a fiction pitched in a fever dream. The title, Nerve Curriculum, is perhaps the most apt description for this work, though it brings to mind the energetic surrealism from having to live perpetually on the verge of living. Next, there was Lance Olson's Always Crashing the Same Car, an homage to the life and legacy of David Bowie that's a literary montage of documentary, intimate conversation, eulogy, and critical opinion piece that rightly switches the writing structure between chapter to chapter from disparate paragraphs separated by asterisms to expositional musings to insightful interviews and letters. This style, combined with Bowie's selfish and haphazard lifestyle, makes every chapter a title chapter and creates for the reader a sensation of being a passenger in a car that is always on the verge of crashing. With a fanatical depth of knowledge of Bowie's life, dedicated research, brutal honesty, and biting criticism, the reader is left wondering if Olson is a diehard Bowie fan or his harshest critic. Next, we had selected translations from Pedro Iris's Divine Comedies. What was interesting about these pieces was the lack of Dantean imagery, instead replaced by all-knowing algorithms and heavenly satellites that command our modern world. The title is somewhat misleading, as Pedro is very liberal with his artistic freedom and interpretation, and it's difficult to draw direct comparisons in the imagery, characters, and narrational structure between his work and the original. When asked about this, Pedro gave a very thought-provoking answer that I think would be useful to any modern writer looking to adapt an earlier work but fearful of repeating the same story. In his answer, he gave me the paradox: we must be mindful and aware of Dante while forgetting everything about Dante. Finally, there was The Galleons by Rick Barrow, a collection of poems inspired by the death of a beloved grandmother woven into the tapestry of Pacific imperial colonialism and its after effects that shaped the world histories and generations that followed. This work was written with brilliant lyricism and layered with poetic forces and patterns that make it a new and enriching experience for even the most perceptive readers after multiple readings. The series is written in couplet form to give it an airy and freeing aesthetic, and interspersed with a series of title poems, The Galleons, that act as anchoring points, moving the reader back and forth between the rest of the work. Some of my favorite aspects of the poems include Barrow's ability to zoom in and focus on the most mundane detail of our daily experience, and then within one stanza zoom out to galactic scale ideas as a way to juxtapose the transcendental with the pedestrian, almost as if he was trying to point out the absurdity and hubris of believing in transcendentalism. Another one of my favorite aspects of his writing was his clever use of punctuation and independent participles, and allowed sentences to take on multiple meanings, either by ending the sentence within the containing couplet or by continuing it on in the next couplet. In their own way, I think each of these works was a wonderful case study that helped answer the question, is literature dead? And if not, what is the role of modern authors? After reading these contemporary pieces, I can confidently say that literature is alive and well. On top of that, I believe I could distill the answer to the second question to be the role of the modern author is to build off of the works of their predecessors to create a new evolution of literature that, one, addresses the challenges of our times, two, strives to explain our human experience to each other more completely through novel and innovative methods, and three, prepares the literary field for the next wave of authors. Much like a scientist using well-established principles of calculus, classical physics, and chemistry to create new disciplines and breakthroughs, each of these authors displayed an intimate knowledge of the principles laid out before them. In some cases, such as with Elizabeth Houston, the authors chose to acknowledge these rules and then flaunt their disregard. But in their own way, this was a form of deference to those guiding principles. Each incorporated meaningful influences that impacted their lives into their works to make them relevant and relatable to a contemporary audience. And each added an original flair to define their own style that provides refreshing iterations or completely original literary forms for the reader. And the Living Writers coursework exponentially enhanced that reading experience. I'm willing to admit that personally, many of these styles were too challenging for me to fully appreciate what was happening underneath the surface. And several were so foreign to me that I would have completely disregarded them if left to assess them on my own. But by discussing these pieces with a diverse group of students with widely ranging experiences and specialties, this gave me a unique insight in just how masterful these writers were. And to have our discussions led by a knowledgeable subject matter expert like Professor Marshall to gently guide the conversation without dictating it and allowing us to draw our own conclusions was a real gift that allowed us to challenge our imposter syndrome and confidently express our creative insights. This experience was further enhanced by the opportunities to meet these writers and discuss their works. The discussions in these sessions ranged from specific theories derived from the writings to technical questions about the author's style, to formulating strategies to manage the creative process, to commiserating about the publishing process, and so much more. Finally, there was the culmination of these lessons, the writing imitations, an exercise where we were challenged to take everything we learned from our readings and discussions and synthesize them into our own imitations of the identified writers. For me, this was the most powerful part of the course because it allowed me to give myself permission to write outside of what I am used to and expand my creativity. While I don't think that I'll be able to ever truly master someone else's style, I do believe that I developed writing techniques and tools that will now be available to me to enhance my own writing. That's why I feel like this course was one of the most meaningful courses of my academic career. Thank you for listening to my long-winded review of this course.